Iran does not recognize Kosovo. Iran and some other Muslim countries do not recognize Kosovo for several reasons. The first one being that it's a de facto protectorate of the USA, and the Kosovars themselves don't have any say in any important matters in their own state. A lot's dictated from Washington, and you'll be hard pressed to find an Albanian that doesn't agree with that statement. So, how does all this apply to Iran? Well, there's obviously these whole artificial separatist movements with fabricated reasons for their existence being pushed by foreign powers, fake movements that have no significant presence in any places other than YouTube, Reddit, and Facebook. These movements are stuff like Arabistan, South Azerbaijan, Eastern Kurdistan, Western Baluchistan. But I'll be talking about those cases in future videos. Those were all made up during the Cold War era and before it. But for the sake of argument here, imagine if Afghan migrants in Iran settled the Iranian Khorasan en masse because of their current situation in towns like Mashhad, Nishapur, Tus, and then some 40 years down the line, with the help of the USA, Khorasan, Iran's northeastern province, cedes violently from Iran. And I don't need any reason to point out why the USA would do something like that. You can't say that Khorasan is not Iran, but rather South Khorasan. Take, for instance, the territory that Afghanistan now controls. All the towns in northern Afghanistan, which are Persian, like Herat, Mazar-e-Sharif, Balkh, those aren't historical Afghan towns. Those cities were all annexed into the Afghan nation state by the Durrani Empire, and the Durranis came from tribal Pashtun origins. The Pashtuns who live in those cities today were relocated or settled there by Abdurrahman Khan, the founder of Afghanistan, in order to tamper with the tribal structures within the state. It was a colonization. Albanians are not the native settlers to Kosovo, and Pashtuns are not the native settlers to Khorasan. So now that you understand this parallel I've made up between Iranian and Afghan territory, this is another reason why Iran and also Azerbaijan are two countries which either have occupied territories themselves or have neighbors who want to take land from them, don't recognize Kosovo. But let's go back in time and analyze what really happened in 1999. The US coalition didn't bomb Serbia because there was an impending genocide or some unavoidable deluge of blood, or on any moral legitimacy. They started bombing Serbia once it became apparent that the Albanian revolt got crushed by the Serbian army. So they went in to protect their own interests. Albanians were the first to start shooting at Serbian police, and the level of violence in Kosovo for the duration of the conflict was contained mostly in areas where the fighting was going on. The total number of civilian casualties for the duration of the conflict for the Albanian side was at maximum 8,000 versus 3,500 on the non-Albanian side, since the KLA targeted everyone, not just the Serbs. And those numbers include the casualties inflicted by NATO on the full territory of Serbia, since their bombs killed everyone there, even the people that NATO was supposedly saving the lives of. The US bombed Serbia and Montenegro because Kosovo is a great geostrategic position to fulfill their objectives in the Balkans, spreading free enterprise and NATO expansionism, and also to curtail the Russian influence, even though Russia had become utterly irrelevant from a geopolitical context by that point. In fact, there's this military base in Kosovo built by the Americans, Camp Bondsteel, and it's the largest and most expensive foreign military base built by the US anywhere in Europe. I won't even bother to go into the details regarding Kosovo's rich mineral wealth that's now entirely owned by American capital. Also, the fact that the Hague Tribunal has only indicted only 8 Albanians and sentenced only 1. And that tells you why the intervention in 1999 was a political setup and not a humanitarian intervention, as many claim it to be, even though anyone who denies what the Albanians had to go through is obviously a horrible person, patently dishonest. But the whole argument that the media was making at the time was that Kosovo was not a dangerous precedent for any nation state that has disgruntled minorities in it. Kosovo is an exception from the norm, sui generis. Something had to be done there because Milosevic wasn't responding to anything. The Serbian government wasn't really seriously negotiating with the Albanians when there was a line in the sand, and there was a humanitarian catastrophe that caused an international refugee crisis. Listen, no one denies any of the stuff. No one denies any of that stuff. No one denies all the shit the Albanians had to go through. Their oppression was real, but none of that was the reason why NATO and the US came into the picture. In fact, there's this documentary that I can recommend you go watch called The Weight of Change, made by Boris Malagorsky, who talks about all this in length, even though he goes so much at length over what happened in Kosovo and barely spends any time over what happened in Bosnia. And by the way, if you ever meet someone who tries to tell you that Srebrenica is a hoax, don't argue with them. Just walk away. You can't convince any of those people. People say that this conflict was the beginning of the end of what was the former Yugoslavia. Back when the conflict started in 1989, and everyone supposedly knew that Kosovo was eventually going to leave the Federation and declare independence. But the problem with that assertion is that it's not looking at history forwards, it's looking at history backwards. And the situation was much more complicated than that. In fact, Kosovo is the most complicated case study of all the other civil wars that happened in Yugoslavia during the 90s. The NATO intervention didn't even have UN Security Council approval. It was an air war when there should have been troops sent to fight in a ground war. The whole basis of the intervention was that the Albanian ultranationalists there wanted to realize their national self-determination and tear apart Kosovo from Serbia because it was exclusively their land and the Serbs were supposedly occupying it and oppressing them. Here's the problem. There's this Ottoman cadastral tax census, a daftar, dating from the year 1455 of the Brankovic lands, which is modern-day Kosovo, and it states the following. There are 13,000 Serb dwellings present in all 480 villages and towns, 75 Vlach dwellings in 34 villages, 46 Albanian ones in 23 villages, 17 Bulgarian ones in 10 villages, 10 Greek ones in Lausha, Vučitrn, and 1 Jewish dwelling in Vučitrn, and one Croatian dwelling. Out of all the names mentioned in that census, conducted by the Ottomans, all the way back in 1455, covering areas of most of present-day Kosovo, 95.88% of all names were of Serbian origin. All roughly, maybe like rounded up, 1.90% of them were Roman, 1.56% were uncertain, and only 0.26% were of Albanian origin, and 0.25% were Greek. Furthermore, the Albanians adopted Islam, started moving into Kosovo after the Great Turkish War, once the Serbs had to leave due to the Ottoman threat against their lives, because they sided with the Austrians, and that's where the Albanian presence in Kosovo begins. Before that, there were none in Kosovo to any significant capacity. But here's the thing. Both the nationalist claims of the Serbs and Albanians are artificial. If you ask the Serb or Albanian in the medieval era about Kosovo, when they weren't from Kosovo, they would have had no idea what you were talking about. The era was pre-national. It's not a real country because it was always part of some other state or empire. Kosovo is simply a geographic designation like Macedonia and Azerbaijan is. It was never its own polity or state in any national sense. The reason there's never been an independent Kosovo in history prior to the breakup of Yugoslavia was because it was always part of the Serbian or Albanian national identity. Kosovo only became a separate vilayet and independent space during the Ottoman era, similarly to what happened to Transylvania after the Hungarian kingdom fell to the Ottomans. That Kosovo vilayet was documented as being an Albanian one in Ottoman records and documents. That was the closest independence and national identity that Kosovo ever had, tops. Serbia has a stake in this because Kosovo was where their independent patriarchate from Constantinople was based and created. It was taken from them abruptly by the Ottomans, and that ended the short-lived Serbian Empire, whereas the Greeks got to keep their own patriarchate under the Turkocratia, Turkish rule. The space of Kosovo got quickly Ottomanized, the Albanians converted and served the Ottoman government, and the rest is history. That was a really stupid decision. It caused so much havoc and problems centuries down the road when the national awakenings arrived in the Balkans. And one other thing. Marshal Tito wanted to get Albania to join Yugoslavia, so he forbade the Serbs from moving back into Kosovo after they fled the region during the Second World War, because the Albanians sided with the Nazis and under their protection began ethnically cleansing the Serbs and other undesirables there. And of course, after the war, Albania being the feudal place that it's historically been, more and more Albanians started migrating into Yugoslavia, predominantly Kosovo, where they lived a relaxed and tax-free life at the expense of every other nationality in Yugoslavia through the state's program for the underdeveloped. And being the good Muslims that they are, they also had between 4 to 9 kids per woman to have the fertility rates in their favor. A few decades later, they began their little rebellion, promptly got crushed, and then called the NATO to win their war for them. Currently, Kosovo is the most poor, backwards, although modern economists don't really like using that term anymore, and criminally led country in Europe. Its population is emigrating in droves, a trend you're seeing all throughout the Balkans. The population there is emigrating in droves, and the region's experiencing a brain drain that seems irreversible. And everyone else who isn't an Albanian has virtually no human rights there and is an open target for unpunished theft of property. This quasi-state can't even sustain itself. And finally, one fun fact. Kosovo is a Serbian word. It derives from the word kos, meaning a blackbird in Serbo-Croatian. So Kosovo is the field of blackbirds, and it's held that name for ages. If the territory is historically Albanian, or became thoroughly Albanized later on, then the Albanian majority there would have changed the name of Kosovo, and as well as the other toponyms in the region, which are all virtually Serbian, and they would have tried to tamper with all the buildings that have survived there since medieval times, along with the monasteries that are Serbian, with precisely 0 Albanian ones. If anybody tells you that Kosovo is Albanian territory, their Albanophilia does not equate to historical facts. But with these demographics I mentioned from the 15th century, we may be talking about an era that was pre-national, but it doesn't matter. It gives us an accurate reflection of the demographics of the region anyways. I mean, like, the Bulgarians and the Magyars who claim Serbian territories as theirs can play at that game as well. It may be a false equivocation, but two can play at that game. There's no question that the Kosovar government installed after the intervention and after Kosovo became independent has no democratic illegitimacy and is pretty much useless and mafioso. It's a disappointment at best, but by European standards, it's still not that shabby. Even if Kosovo is part of historical Serbia, which it is no longer part of the country, yet it's still seen as lost territory. It's understandable why Serbs still obsess over Kosovo and Republika Srpska, the Serb entity in Bosnia, because they lost everything in the Yugoslav civil wars, and if they had kept Kosovo, Yugoslavia would still have had a prospect of living on. The ultranationalists there, the Albanian ultranationalists there, started with the premise that Kosovo is historically Albanian land, which it most certainly is not. That's the first point. The second point is that the quasi-country of Kosovo is something which is a direct result of a foreign intervention, that is to say, the 1999 NATO bombings, along with communist meddling with the demographics since 1945. The communist meddling forbade some 140,000 people from returning to Kosovo after the war, which brought up the Albanian population's percentage from 30% to 60%, and 250,000 people were expelled from Kosovo following the NATO bombings in 1999, which brought up the Albanian population to what it is now, from 60% to 90%. So two can play at this game indeed. This is how shallow the whole argument is. Retaking Kosovo would be a matter of days for the Serbian military, provided that people stop caring about this whole issue, which seems to be the new norm as of late. So, is Kosovo Serbia? It is if the Serbs say it is. It is especially so if the Serbian government says that it is. It's obviously blocking the Kosovar Albanians from joining any serious international organizations, and half the world doesn't even recognize Kosovo as an independent state, including Iran and several other anti-Western and anti-American nation states from the same region. If Albanians have the right to declare independence and secede by force, then the Serbs most certainly have the right to retake their rightful province. And trust me, they have more means than they need to. To be clear, I personally hope that the Serbs and Albanians can come up with a peaceful resolution, but nevertheless, the situation's not nearly as simple as people like John Bolton make it out to be. All of Albania's neighbors have a very strong negative opinion of them. Not just Serbia. At the moment, Albanians are the only nation in the Balkans that have an active irredentist policy and claim the territories and want to take land from everyone that has a land border with them. Kosovo was not part of a federal system, but a province of a federal member that was occupied by force and declared independent, which was not only unconstitutional, but in direct opposition to UN Resolution 1244. As such, it can only be reintegrated in its previous status. So when people say that the Serbs want the territory and never wanted to reintegrate it into some reformed Yugoslav federation that no longer existed, annexation didn't even apply to the situation and still doesn't apply to the situation now. You can't, in the right mind, objectively claim that the independence of the province was right. Otherwise, the same case could be made for virtually every country in the world that owns a region that's inhabited by a non-native population. Plus, in Kosovo's case, the demographic shift only occurred in a span of less than 50 years. So there isn't even a historical claim that the Albanians have. Just a simple land grab made possible by overpopulation, foreign military intervention for the geopolitical purposes of that time, and the expulsion of non-Albanian citizens as a direct result of it. People in the Middle Ages were a resource, nothing else. If you were a German that owned a French village, you didn't tell the villagers to move back to France. You taxed them and mobilized them in case of a war. The borders of the Balkans, even though they were always in a constant state of flux, permanently changing, the people always stayed where they were. No feudal lord would relocate them because empty land was useless land to them. And that's precisely why the Ottoman Daftar that I mentioned earlier is important to point out, since it pretty accurately tells you who the natives of Kosovo are, and they were Serbs. And before them, and whichever population existed there before the Slavic presence in the Balkans assimilated into the Slavic culture and adopted the Slavic language, whether they were Illyrian, Thracian, Dardanian, or whatever. But they most certainly were not Albanians, seeing how they're only mentioned in any written document in history for the first time from the 11th century onwards. They spread into their modern-day territories only after they adopted Islam at the expense of everyone else that surrounded them, not long after the Great Turkish War of 1683 to 1699. Any claim that they predate anyone in the Balkans was quite frankly nonsensical, because no national identities even existed in that era, even if the Albanians are indeed the descendants of the Illyrians. And by the way, during the Balkan Wars, the Albanians, side of the Ottomans, they were on the losing side. They lost. The only reason they got a country is because Italy wanted Albania for themselves, and Austria didn't want the Greeks or the Serbs to expand. In other words, someone just gave their own nation state to them, just as someone else gave them Kosovo. They didn't earn it for themselves, like every other Balkan country had to do. The Greater Albania agenda is also a popular sentiment among Albanians. Macedonia had an insurgency in 2001 and another one recently in 2015. And both occasions they kept waving their Greater Albania flags everywhere. And that flag is popular everywhere they are. So their aspirations for a Greater Albania certainly isn't debatable, but that's another story for another time. And this is where I end my dissertation. Thank you for watching.